All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. All right. Our speaker is Donald Greg Rose. He's an associate professor at Bryn Athyn College of the New Church. He's in his 19th year of teaching a variety of political science and history courses, as well as a religion course on Islam. He completed his master's in National Security Affairs and Middle East Studies at the Naval Postgraduate School and his PhD in Political Science at the University of Pittsburgh. He's married to the former Jessica Pendleton. They share 3 children and 7 grandchildren. Greg joined the U.S. Air Force in 1985 as an intelligence officer, and he and Jessie enjoyed living in a variety of places during his 20-year career. A Middle East specialist, he traveled to several countries in the region and served on the faculty of the U.S. Air Force Special Operations School. There, he taught in the cross-cultural communications course and started to develop his thinking on cultural differences. He retired from the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel. And most importantly, he's very good at volleyball and willing to teach other people, like myself, how to get better at it. Please welcome Greg Rose.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thanks for your attention. How's the microphone doing? Are we all right there? Good? Okay, great. So, for a few minutes, I want to talk about how weird Americans are, and then add some thoughts about how to get over weirdness and fight against it. And what I'm going to start doing is comparing cultural psychologies around the world. And as I do this, I'm leaning on a lot of different studies that have been done. And you can get a good summary of these by either reading some Jonathan Haidt or some Joseph Henrich. I think there's pieces of paper around referring to Joseph Henrich's latest book. And one thing to be aware of is that weird countries like ours are unusual in the world and in human history. And to be clear, weird is not an insult, it's an acronym. These weird countries, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries, have developed a cultural psychology different from the rest of the world. And this is part of the reason for culture shock. When people from the rest of the world visit here, they can't understand why we do things the way we do. And the same thing happens when weird people go to other parts of the world. They don't understand why things are done so differently there. And what I want to do is partly explain why that culture shock happens, where this different thinking comes from. And to summarize quickly, all societies construct their cultural systems by selecting themes and concepts from 3 clusters of cultural themes. And I'm going to introduce these very quickly. Start with the autonomy cluster because this is the one we're most familiar with. This is what we pull on primarily. In this autonomy cluster, human beings are, first and foremost, autonomous individuals with wants, needs, and preferences. And the idea is that people should be free to satisfy these wants, needs, and preferences. So, societies that pull on this autonomy cluster of cultural values develop concepts like rights, liberty, and justice to protect those autonomous individuals. And here's just one example, a quote from Ayn Rand, and just think about this one for a second. Individual rights are the means of subordinating society to moral law. The highest moral law is individual rights, and society should be subordinated to that. That's not the only cultural theme that societies around the world can pull from. In the community theme, people are first and foremost not autonomous individuals, but members of a larger entity. Whether it's a tribe, a family, a nation, a company, an army, those larger entities are more than the sum of the individuals that make them up. They're real, they should be protected. And that sometimes means that individual wants, needs, and preferences are not the priority. And even us weird people understand this. People have an obligation to play their assigned roles in these entities, whether they're families or tribes or nations. So societies develop concepts like duty and hierarchy and respect. And in societies that privilege the community cluster of themes, the Western weird insistence that people should pursue their own goals seems selfish, dangerous, a sure way to weaken the social fabric that everyone depends on. Now notice, as you look at all these cultural themes, we're familiar with all of them. Every human being understands all of these things, but different cultures emphasize different clusters or different buckets of these themes. In this third cluster, people are not primarily autonomous individuals. They're not primarily members of larger identities. They are, what's the reference here? Creation. People are vessels of a soul with a divine source. They're not just conscious animals. They're children of God, and they should behave accordingly. There are actions that can degrade people and dishonor their creator. And this is where we get this idea in 1 Corinthians that the body is a temple, not a playground. Again, different human societies sample from these themes or buckets or clusters and construct different cultural systems. Our weird culture samples more extensively from the left side, the autonomy bucket. We are very excited about rights and liberties. Arab culture samples way more from the community theme. Those larger entities are much more important in the Middle East. But the bottom line is that Western cultural psychology is individualistic. And this is one attempt to show sort of the gradations between individualistic weird cultures on the left and an acronym I just made up, the rest of the world, where there's more emphasis on group conformity and hierarchy. And I'll give you a few examples of how these work out in practice. Think for a second how you would finish the sentence, I am. Think three words or phrases you might conclude that sentence, I am. And just see how you match up with weird and rest of world ideas. Weird people tend to finish that sentence with some personal attribute, ability, or achievement. I am curious. I'm outgoing. I'm interested in jazz. I'm a scientist. I'm a runner. Whereas in the rest of the world, they tend to put themselves in a relationship. I am Donald's son. I'm Jesse's husband. I'm an employee of Bryn Athyn College. Roles and relationships is how the first way they describe themselves, not some personal attribute. That idea of relationships and the importance of protecting those larger entities was brought home to me when I was stationed at Hurlburt Field in Florida, where there was a school that international students came to from militaries around the world. And there was a group of Arab officers from all over the Middle East who attended the air-to-ground operations school one year. And they were going through the school, and they sort of formed this quasi-kinship group, this larger entity that was really important, more important than the individuals that made it up. And one day they approached the instructor and said, there's an exam scheduled in the course, and it's on an important Islamic holiday. And the instructor said, oh, I wasn't aware. Should we reschedule the exam? No, there's no need to do that. We just need time to pray during the exam. Got it, understood. So in the middle of the exam, the senior Arab officer got up. He was also the best student, and he started chanting in Arabic. The answer to number 1 is B. The answer to number 2 is C. What was he doing? He was cheating. And he knew he was cheating. The whole subterfuge was planned carefully. But what was more important than cheating? Taking care of his kinship group. Yeah. One more hypothetical situation for you. You're driving in a car with a friend. That friend is driving way too fast, way over the speed limit, and sure enough, they hit a pedestrian. And in the ensuing court case, your friend's lawyer approaches you and says, you know, if you testify that your friend was driving the speed limit, that'll save them a whole lot of trouble. What do? 90% of weird people tell the truth. They're not going to lie for their friend. A majority of people in the rest of the world will testify to protect their friend. Roles and relationships are more important than some abstract concept of honesty. That sort of thinking starts very early and gets drilled in from earliest times. There are big differences in how American and Japanese mothers play with their children. American mothers are twice as likely to use object labels. This is a block. This is a red block. Do you like the block? Japanese mothers are twice as likely to engage in social routines. I give you a marble. Now you give it to me. Thank you. Very early on, American children learn that the world is mostly a place filled with discrete objects. Japanese children learn that the world is mostly about relationships. Some of you might recognize this early reader that weird people learn to read on, and there's a weird autonomous person running and playing. The Chinese had a similar reader. I'm just going to tell you the first few sentences in the Chinese reader. Big brother takes care of little brother. Big brother loves little brother. Little brother loves big brother. Take a look at this beautiful submarine photo. Let that sink in for a moment. What do you remember about the photo? Oh, thank you so much. That was great. The turtle. You're so weird. That's great. Everyone in the world remembers the turtle. They'll all talk about the turtle. But the first thing Americans say is, there's a turtle. The first thing people in Japan say is something about the environment. Well, there's this coral reef, and in the coral reef there are a lot of things, and this turtle is among them. It's the environment and the context that is the first thing they recall, not the dominant turtle. So, at the University of Iowa, one year, this is 1991, I think, a Chinese graduate student shot some people. And what I want to show you is how this was reported in American newspapers and Chinese newspapers. So just take a look at the emphases of the different newspapers. On the left, you notice American newspapers focused on individual qualities, personal dispositions. Chinese newspapers focused on the context, the environment, situational factors, relationships, societal qualities. And some people said, yeah, that's because the shooter was a Chinese graduate student. So they tested it on another shooting where the perpetrator was American and the reports were the same. The Chinese newspapers focused on the situational, environment, societal qualities, and the American newspapers focused on personal dispositions. The result of all this is contrasting cultural psychologies. In weird cultures, we have independent and individualistic and separate focus, whereas in the rest of the world, we have integrated societies and with a focus on relationships. That summary of weird culture on the left applies to every weird culture that you saw in aquamarine colors on the slide earlier, every Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic culture. But it seems like we Americans have taken it to another level. This is a picture of Alexis de Tocqueville, a French aristocrat, and I'm going to use several quotes from his work Democracy in America, based on his observations when he toured the country in 1831. And when he did that, he articulated the downside, a negative aspect of our focus on individual liberty and equality. It must be recognized that equality suggests very dangerous instincts to men. It tends to isolate them from one another and to lead each one of them to be interested only in himself alone. It opens their souls excessively to love of material enjoyments. So as the American experiment launched, the individualism of Western civilization became turbocharged here. And people noticed. Real concerns emerged. This is Samuel Mitchell. He was a member of the House of Representatives from New York and then a senator. And he was described as New York's most publicly universal gentleman, a man known as a living encyclopedia. Thomas Jefferson called him the Congressional Dictionary. Think of Ken Jennings back in the 1800s. This is what he had to say. The problem with America was that everybody wanted independence. First independence from Great Britain, then independence of the states from each other, then independence of the people from government, and lastly, the members of society to be equally independent of each other. The quest for independence had broken down societal connections and obligations. And the question was, what would hold the country together? What would prevent individual isolation? The answer for much of the last 220 years was that people became members of associations and organizations. This is Gordon Wood. He's our leading historian of the American Revolution and the early Republic. And he writes about how quickly this trend started as people joined mechanic societies, humane societies, orphans asylums, missionary societies, marine societies, tract societies, Bible societies, temperance associations, on and on. Alexis de Tocqueville noticed this when he visited in 1831. Americans of all ages, of all conditions, of all minds constantly unite. Not only do they have commercial and industrial associations in which they all take part, but also they have 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, intellectual, serious, useless, very general, very particular, immense, very small. And he goes on. 50 years later, the diplomat and historian James Bryce noticed this when he was ambassador here from the United Kingdom. Associations are created, extended, and worked in the United States more quickly and effectively than in any other country. A few years later, the German sociologist Max Weber commented on this. It's been a characteristic precisely of the specifically American democracy that it does not constitute a formless sand heap of individuals, but rather a buzzing complex of voluntary associations. This was clearly evident during World War I. The US Food Administration was created in 1917, and they began a campaign to convince Americans to change their eating habits so there would be enough food to feed the military and starving civilians in Europe. So they were trying to conserve wheat, meat, sugar, fats, so they could be sent overseas. At one point, there were 9,630 chapters, lodges, or branches of more than 30 different secular associations involved in the food conservation program. That's nearly 10,000 chapters of 31 different associations. And that was in Iowa. With a population of 2.5 million people in 1918. This is a list of a sum of the mostly service organizations active in the 20th century. And some of us will remember at least some of these, but when I talk to college students in my classes, many of them have never even heard of the Kiwanis, the Rotary, the Lions, the Elk, the Moose. Why is this? Americans aren't joining associations these days. This is Robert Putnam of Harvard University. In 1995, he wrote an article, Bowling Alone. He turned it into a book and a whole research program that he's still doing. And in this article, he outlined the rapid decline of civic groups and associations of all kinds in the last few decades. Whether it's labor unions, professional associations, churches, PTAs, Lions, Elks, Kiwanis, or bowling leagues, they've all lost members by the boatload. And just like around 1800, around 2000, the question became, what will hold the country together? If we're not joining associations as much, what happens to society and individuals? This was a 2020 piece in 60 Minutes, and just last year, the US Surgeon General highlighted the problem in a report on loneliness and isolation. There's certainly room for concern, so I'm going to turn to an idea about what we can do about it. Participate. Join something. This is what Yuval Levin talks about in his book, and fortunately, it's recommended to every new American citizen. This is a picture of a naturalization ceremony where people are taking the Pledge of Allegiance for the first time as citizens. And you'll notice a couple of them are holding a white envelope. Every new citizen gets this white envelope, and in it is a document from the Citizenship and Immigration Services that has a section with 2 columns. One's titled Your Rights, and the other is Your Responsibilities. There's the list of rights that they're told about. You recognize many of these. Pursue life, liberty, and happiness. These are good rights. And here's the responsibilities. I don't know if it's telling that the list of responsibilities is longer than the rights, but notice the emphasis on participation. And this is just great advice for new citizens or any citizens. For instance, one thing you can do is go to church. Just look at the difference in life satisfaction the more you attend religious services, or maybe even attend community suppers. There's a note on this one. This chart has been brought to you by the Bryn Athyn Church pastoral staff. Yeah. But it's not just attending church services. It's joining a church or some other association, becoming a member. Levin argues that we need to commit to some kind of organization, association, or institution. And not just for the sake of the country or society, but for our own sakes. For me, his most important insight is that institutions are by their nature formative. Think of a concrete form. It takes semi-liquid concrete that wants to ooze everywhere and turns it into something structured and useful. Institutions structure the way we think and interact, and as a result, they structure us. When we participate in a family, a team, or an organization, we begin to take that institution's shape. That shape then enables us to be more effective. We aren't just loose individuals running around bumping into each other. We fill roles, we play parts, and that helps us understand our obligations. Joining a team gives you a role and a position, literally. Soccer goalies, hockey goalies, they can't just go wherever they want. They've got a role to play. Entering the institution of marriage gives you a new identity and directs your behavior. This idea of institutions shaping us is not necessarily welcomed by weird individualistic Americans. We like personal freedom and choice. By shaping and reforming us, institutions play a role I'd rather believe is unnecessary. Our will is not enthusiastic about the need for reforming. And perhaps increasingly, we see examples of people selfishly exploiting institutions. Look at this passage on self-love. If we love ourselves, we want our church, our country, human communities, and the people around us to serve us. We do not want to serve them. We place ourselves above them. We put them beneath ourselves. Rather than taking advantage of the formative nature of institutions, some people put them beneath and use them as platforms for boosting their personal agendas or brands. In Levin's terminology, they turn potentially formative institutions into performative stages. That is, they use an organization as a stage on which to perform rather than letting the institution reform them into effective members. And you can probably think of members of Congress very quickly who use Congress rather than letting Congress shape them into effective legislators, use them as performative stages. This is ironic because there are real personal benefits to playing roles in institutions. This is my favorite quote from Tocqueville. Feelings and ideas are renewed, the heart is enlarged, and the human mind is developed only by the reciprocal action of men one upon another. And this reminded me of another quote. God loves every one of us, but cannot directly benefit us. He can only benefit us only indirectly through each other. I'm going to take a break in a moment, but before I do, one last quote that I think ties some of these things up well. America's increasing individualism, diversity, dynamism, and liberalization has come at the cost of dwindling solidarity, cohesion, stability, authority, and social order. But there is an alternative to hyper-individualism. It can be found in institutions and relationships. These begin in loving family attachments. They spread outward to relationships in neighborhoods, schools, workplaces, religious communities, civic associations, activist groups, and they conclude in a national identity that is dedicated to the principle of the equality of the entire human race. That's a few things to think about. I'm going to come back in a few minutes with some closing thoughts, but I think Malcolm is going to suggest you take a break for dessert. Is that right, Malcolm? Where did Malcolm? Oh, there you are. So I'd just like to wrap up with a couple of stories based around the themes of 6 hours and 6 seconds, and I do have a point to these stories. You might get to wonder where I'm going, but I do have a point. So, 6 hours. You've probably never heard of Roy Benavidez. That's too bad, but it's understandable. A Hollywood producer was apparently once asked why his story wasn't a movie. And after reading it, he shook his head and said, "No one would believe it." And what I'm going to tell you leaves out some amazing details for the sake of time. So Roy Benavidez was the son of a Mexican-American farmer and a Native American mother. His father died when he was 3 and his mother when he was 8. He and his brothers were raised by his uncle in El Campo, Texas. And he and his now 9 siblings worked in the beet fields to contribute to his family's income. This made him miss 4 months of school each year. So he struggled to keep up. He was put in remedial classes and taunted as a dumb Mexican. Those taunts and resentment of the various Jim Crow-era signs around town resulted in schoolyard fights, frequent trips to the principal's office, and when he was 15, he dropped out of school to work full-time. He eventually joined the Texas National Guard when he was 17 and later switched to active duty in the U.S. Army. He served in Korea and Germany and then was one of the early advisors sent to Vietnam as the U.S. ramped up its activity there. He arrived in 1964 to help train the Vietnamese army, and while on a patrol, he stepped on and triggered a landmine. Partially paralyzed, he was sent home to the Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio and told he would never walk again and that he would be medically discharged. He began secretly rehabbing himself and got to the point where he avoided discharge and was given an administrative job. But he wanted to get back to Vietnam. So he got himself back into operational units and eventually earned the Green Beret of Army Special Forces. And by early 1968, he was back in Vietnam. On May 2nd, 1968, he was off duty at his base near the Cambodian border when he overheard some radio chatter and heard that one of his unit's patrols had been surrounded by enemy infantry. All 12 of the men in the patrol had suffered serious injuries. He jumped onto a helicopter that was going to extract them. Landing in a clearing, he ran 80 yards through small arms fire towards the trapped men. He was hit in his right leg, face, and head. He organized the surviving injured soldiers into a defensive position and started applying medical aid, then popped a smoke grenade to signal the extraction point to the helicopter. When it landed, he carried those too injured to walk while firing at the enemy. As he dragged one body to the helicopter, he was shot again in the back. At the same time, a hand grenade exploded nearby, peppering him with shrapnel and knocking him out. When he regained consciousness, he made his way towards the helicopter, only to find it burning. It had been hit and the pilot killed, but the other occupants survived. Knowing that the smoking helicopter would attract enemy attention, he pulled them out and moved them to a new defensive position, just in time as mortar shells started crashing into the area where the helicopter was. From his new position, he called for another extraction helicopter and directed airstrikes against the enemy. Another helicopter arrived and tried to extract them, but it was shot down as well. The crew survived and joined Benavides and his group in their defensive position. Another helicopter finally arrived, and as he was loading a wounded man into it, an enemy soldier came at him with a bayonet and slashed his arm open, then broke his jaw with the butt of his rifle. Benavides stabbed his assailant to death, then shot 2 more enemy soldiers who were charging the aircraft. He was the last one aboard the helicopter. Once aboard, he passed out. He had been fighting and carrying and communicating for 6 hours. He received 37 wounds from small arms fire, grenade shrapnel, the bayonet, and the rifle butt that broke his jaw. When he woke up, it was to the sound of a body bag being zipped up as the medics thought he was dead. His eyes were pasted shut by crusted blood. He couldn't move his broken jaw to speak and was too weak to move any limbs. He did the only thing he could do. He spat at the doctor who leaned down to check for a pulse. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and another 4 Purple Hearts. It took more than a year to recover, but he served another 8 years in the Army, retiring in 1976. His medal was upgraded in 1981 to the Medal of Honor, and he spent the rest of his life working for disabled veterans' causes. That's 6 hours. 6 seconds. On April 22, 2008, 2 Marines, Corporal Yale and Lance Corporal Herder, took their posts at the entrance gate to Joint Security Station Nasser, an outpost in the Iraqi city of Ramadi that contained a makeshift barracks housing 50 other Marines and about 100 Iraqi security personnel. Yale, on the left, was a poor mixed-race kid from Virginia supporting a wife, daughter, mother, and a sister who lived with him. Herder was a middle-class white kid from Long Island. They were from different worlds and different battalions and probably met when they assumed sentry duty that day. Their orders were to stand their post and understood with the Marine Corps' general orders for centuries, the last one of which is this: allow no one to pass without proper authority. A few minutes after they took their posts, a blue truck turned into the alleyway, which is maybe 60 or 70 yards long. At this point, Yale and Herder had 6 seconds to live. The truck accelerated as it wound through the serpentine of concrete walls, and the Iraqi security personnel started running. Yale and Herder started firing their weapons. They kept firing, blowing out the windshield of the truck and killing the suicide bomber just before the truck reached the gate. It stopped, then detonated, killing Yale and Herder. 24 brick houses were damaged or destroyed in the blast. A mosque 100 yards away collapsed. The truck's engine landed 200 yards away, and from the blast damage, they think the truck contained about 2,000 pounds of explosives. A few of the Iraqi guards were injured, but the rest of the Iraqis and the Marines in the barracks were safe. I highlight these stories because the military is the most explicitly formative of our institutions. Every military service tells you up front, we're going to mold you into a different person. We're going to form everyday recruits from a variety of backgrounds into soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, willing to do incredible things for their comrades and country. But every institution has a formative capacity if you let it. When you join a club or organization or play for a team or enter into an institution like parenthood, you're acknowledging your willingness to be formed by it, to abide by its rules, norms, and expectations. Fortunately, most of us won't be faced with situations like those of Benavides, Yale, and Herder. But given the example, their example, and the example of the institutions that formed them, what will we do with the time and opportunities we've been given? Will we let institutions help to reform us? Thanks for your attention.
We will now have 10 minutes of digestion and discussion. So talk to the people at your tables, and I encourage you to talk about the things from the presentation. And then we'll have time for people to come up and ask our presenter questions after 10 minutes. So you can talk to other people to formulate your question really well, and then we'll go over there. So 10 minutes, we'll have a Q&A. So a serious question. One reason people give for not participating in institutions is because they feel disillusioned about those institutions or feel mixed about the impact of those institutions on the world. It could be the government, or it could be the military, or the church. So what do you think, or when do you think it's the right choice to participate in a flawed organization, and when do you think it's the right choice to steer clear of a flawed organization? Just starting off with the easy one.
Easy one, yeah. Am I on? Yes. I'll be deliberately provocative again. What a weird question. Get over yourself. All human organizations are flawed. And the point of being in these organizations and institutions is not to validate your personal agenda. It's to reform yourself. Now, notice Greg didn't say, go ahead and join the local satanic death cult. But I think it's, I'll recall from the early part of Matthew somewhere, Matthew 7 maybe. Judge not, motes, beams, specks in eyes. Use the institutions. Don't think they're there to validate your opinion on everything. So that's how I would respond, but that's being provocative.
Great, thanks.
I guess my question's a little bit similar to those. I hear you saying about this weird attitude. There are some advantages and disadvantages, some positives and negatives about the Western mindset. And it needs to be balanced out with a focus on community and participation. And I'm not sure if I got so clearly from you what are the downsides of the community and participation. And I'm partly thinking of communism as an example of, I think, a flawed institution that one could validly ask, is the Chinese Communist Party doing the kind of good for the Eastern society that we should encourage people to become a part of it and be formed by that institution? What are the downsides of putting community ahead of individualism to the extent that the individual rights and justice and liberty disappear?
Yeah. How provocative am I going to be? Because the example that comes to mind is a really grim one. And that, from my experience in the Middle East, where community is more important than individual wants, needs, and preferences, and where tribe and family are paramount and their interests are above individuals, what happens if a The daughter of a family is accused of extramarital relationships. Honor killing. The honor of the tribe is at stake. Therefore, that individual will be sacrificed. That's a big downside. But I think you had the right word, and that's the balance. In our human society major at the college, and I see Magnus, he can probably testify for this one. What we talk about this interesting conundrum we have. The important individual things going on are repentance, reformation, regeneration. The ironic thing is those individual things can only happen in society. So we have to have that balance. And yes, there are some bad organizations and there are some bad individuals, and it's finding that happy medium. That's the best I got right now. I warned Malcolm, I'm terrible at Q&A. This is the worst part of the whole thing.
At the risk of having a similar question to John, I just want to say that I felt convicted by the very end of your presentation where you showcased 3 very honorable soldiers. And the reason I felt convicted is because I've come to an opinion, at least my current opinion, it could change. Over the years, I've come to this opinion that militaries are often used by their governments to do heinous things. And I even include the United States government in that. And so I'm a little conflicted about this, and I don't specifically have a question, but I just want to give you an opportunity to comment if you want to, and I'll sit down even if you don't comment.
Thank you. Countries, institutions, organizations can do terrible things. And what struck me watching a lot of people who suffered in the military, and I had lunch recently with one of the last Marines who came out of Kabul International Airport. He was one of those people getting people on planes, evacuating Afghanistan. He was one of the last people there, under fire every day for weeks. And it certainly affected him, but the relationships he developed, the friendships, the things he learned from that, it's still difficult for him, but it's ended up as a real positive in his life. That opportunity is there. Terrible things can happen, but I'm just struck by the number of people who benefit through those struggles and challenges in their lives. No guarantee, but the opportunity is there.
Thanks, great for the presentation. I'm really excited about the subject because partially I grew up in China, so I kind of have first-hand experience with that, communist mentality. Just a bit of background. My parents, they went through the Cultural Revolution, right? The whole period, it was nothing but poverty and denigration of individualism. So I know, like, when I talk to them, their sense of self is almost close to zero. To them, it's all about we. It's all about relationships. And I see the problems that manifest in their life is that the relationship in the family is just so broken up. It's like everybody just complain about each other, mishmashing, codependency, so on and so forth. It was just horrible. And I'm glad that I left when I was 18 and came to the US. Long story short, what I've been doing is try to take responsibility as an individual, not as we, not as a group, right? By doing the right thing, by learning how to apply the teaching from the New Heavenly Doctrine, and it has been working so wonderfully in my life as an individual. Now, when I oftentimes bring the writings to my families, my relatives, because they don't have, because of this group mentality they grew up with, they was like, they were very passive, they were avoiding, so they don't never believe that, I I can do this. So to me, it's very sad because this mentality of a community comes first. There's no individual whatsoever. So I guess my question is, I'm just kind of adding fuel to, John mentioned about like, what are the concrete or any preventions that can be put in place among those institutions to prevent the diminishing of individual regeneration or opportunity for individual regeneration? Because I do believe ultimately it all comes down to the individual will wanting to be regenerated by the Lord. That's it. But at the same time, there are other people, I do believe, because I experienced that, they are, for whatever reason, they are unwilling or they are not ready to go through that process. So they would use this, it's all in the name of we. There's no you or I. That, to me, that really still that individual freedom that to be regenerated. So I don't know if I put it in the best way, but yeah.
I don't have a good answer to that statement. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. I'll just comment that weird culture is unusual in the world and in human history. Somehow, for thousands of years, people managed, we have memorable relations from the most ancient church and the ancient church. Somehow, those collective societies managed to get people to heaven. I don't completely understand that, but because I'm a weird American, but it can happen, apparently. So I'll just say what I said before, that it's that finding that balance, I think, is the important thing.
Hi, I'm Julie Conneran. I want to know if I'm weird or not, because obviously you can tell by the funny accent that I'm English, but I've lived most of my time here, not including in Texas, in Iran, and a lot of other places. So am I weird or not?
Malcolm distributed some little pieces of paper with some book recommendations. And that first recommendation, The Weirdest People in the World, in several places it goes through all the different psychological experiments that are given to people to show how weird are you. And it's a great book in that it'll point out that the weirdest people in some instances are in Sweden, and in some places in America, and some places in France. And the least weird, sometimes it's Kenya, sometimes it's Japan, sometimes it's China. And you can just see all the countries arrayed on different things, and you can look at the questions and figure out where you are. But from what I know about you, yes, you're weird.
Hi. My question is, do you have any insight into, you say that all these organizations that we've, supported all these years, the Rotary and all, they're all losing members and it's in decline. Do you have any insight into why that seems to be happening now? And a further question is there any good news? Can you see on the horizon any new organizations coming up that are actually gaining members?
Yeah. Robert Putnam has continued his research in that area, and so picking up his trail, the book was Bowling Alone, then he came up with another one called Better Together, and I think a third one was something about Our Kids, where he continues to try and figure out what kinds of organization are important, how they're important, what's happening to them. In Bowling Alone, he starts to go into some of the possible reasons for the decline, but they're unsurprising ones, like the increasing pace of American life and the lack of margin in people's lives. Their page is full. They can't figure out how to have time to join organizations. He also pointed to the increasing individuality of entertainment, where we used to go to watch Lincoln and Douglas debate as a whole town. Then we went as groups to movie theaters. Then we watched TV as families, and now we've all got our individual screens. So those sort of trends all seem to add up to that less joining culture. One objection to Putnam's work was that, Bob, you missed out on online communities. These are a thriving thing. They're gonna replace the Elks Club. And so he did the research, and that's what Better Together was about. And he did studies and showed that actually no, online communities don't do it. It's face-to-face communities that build social capital and increase interpersonal trust. That's the key thing. But no, I can't think of any right now. I told Malcolm, at 3 in the morning, I'll wake up and think, I know, I remember now. But right now, I can't think of any examples of possibilities. Yuval Levin talks about this a bit in his book that's listed on that piece of paper, and he recommends increasing subsidiarity, that is, get local. Don't worry about national politics, get local and build things.
Going to be mean and ask you to prognosticate a little bit. I'm also very interested in how weird and new weird societies are. And how do you see it blending going forward? Like, is the rest of the world going to become more weird? Is that going to sort of burn its way out? We're going to become more like the rest of the world?
Yeah.
I'm going to let you pick,
right.
Just a little vignette there.
That'll be easy to answer. That's Stephen Cole's here, right? Stephen Cole, there he is. And can you wave your book up in the air? There it is. The Weirdest People in the World, Joseph Henrich. I pick on Stephen because I know he's got 3 copies of that, so if you steal it, he might not notice. He makes the case that weird society started developing around 500 AD, and by 1200 it was well on its way. So that's how new or old it is, depending on how you look at it. I think there's some really good things about weird society. I'm partial, and as I said, the key processes are individual processes. So I think there's a reason for weird society to have been developed, and perhaps it's not a coincidence that Swedenborg emerged from a very weird place and emphasized those key individual things: repentance, reformation, regeneration. But I'm the worst prognosticator in the world. I can still give you 33 reasons why Saddam Hussein will not invade Kuwait. So I will not prognosticate, sorry.
Thank you.
So I know from your history you've been exposed to many parts of the world and many cultures, and I've been thinking recently, when you think of the clusters, I'm wondering if we're going through a cycle of cluster shift, where what I mean is if you take the theory of democracy, and it feels more like we're bending towards tribalism on a national level, which is based on the individual thing. So do you have any comment on that based on your experience? And then I have another comment.
It's a difficult time in American politics. The tribalism thing is hitting us at a time where American culture is, in many ways, catching up with the rest of the world in secularizing. And it seems as if people are trying to find meaning in politics rather than in religion. Good luck with that. And at the same time, we've got the silo effect of social media. You enter those echo chambers and only hear the same things that you've been saying. So it's an interesting time, and I would prefer to step back for a second and look at it on the long term And I try to maintain optimism by looking at previous times in American history where similar things have happened, and we've broken out of these ruts of tribalism and polarization and gone through a wave of better time. I'm mystified as to how that happened and how it could happen again, but I'm comforted by the fact that it has happened before.
Thank you. My second thing I wanted to comment, following up on Peter's comment, I just wanted people to know that the experience of the military, when you talk about forming or reforming a person, there's no stronger institution that requires that. And I can tell you from my own experience that no combat veteran likes war, and I believe everybody loses when you're engaged in one. Having said that, it boils down to those two men at the gate, or the Medal of Honor winner. You end up fighting to survive and to have your brother survive. And you're given the opportunity in those circumstances that when it's all on the line, you're tested by that. And if that doesn't form you in some way, so I know it's graphic, I know it's hard to hear, but I just want to speak to whatever the politicians are doing, the military is still an honorable profession.
Thank you.
So, you know, in times of national crisis or global crisis, that sort of sense of community and unity behind institutions becomes more prevalent. And so there's clearly, you know, a less, if you're weird and you are maybe not as connected to some of the fundamental grounding things like poverty and hunger and just existential terror in, you know, just in your daily life, in your community, it's easier to get away from that survival instinct in that community. And I'm curious, in your opinion, are there any ways that we can engage people in that sense of unity and urge to connect and groundedness that are not fear-based? You know, connect to that grounded, rooted, connected feeling that isn't just fear.
Yeah. I was thinking about that earlier because successful organizations, institutions, associations, to enter them, there's some challenge. And the best ones can do it without fear. And so all I can do is say, great idea. Because I think that's the key, is to have a challenge that bonds people together, some trying time, some struggle, without the negative associations of fear. But no, I don't have any brilliant ideas, but I think that you're on the right track there.
I was hesitating, but it just seems to fit maybe right now, and that is, as a weird liberal arts college professor, I like to experiment on my students, and so in recent years I've been doing the I am question at the beginning of the course, and say, here, tell me about yourselves, when I've really got my hidden agenda, and to a large extent, surprise, surprise, my college students fall into the weird mode. But the big exception is when they identify with sports teams. And so I am a lacrosse player, I'm a hockey player, I'm on the hockey team, and it's maybe a faint image of what it's like to be in the military. I got up to mention this because I think it is a positive, challenging place where people, I don't think sports teams are on the wane right now. I think a lot of our organizations are, but I think that's a place where people are finding that kind of the challenge and the community. And I know you like sports, so maybe you want to comment on that.
It's a great point, and that's when John Haidt came out with his book, The Righteous Mind, and he was trying to come up with examples on that. I wrote to him and pointed out he underplayed that. He should have hit that harder, because that's exactly right. that's what, especially college students, they can relate to that. They're perhaps in the most individualistic part of their lives, just emerging as adults, but then they remember, oh, that's right, I'm on a team and I don't get to do whatever I want. And so that is a great relationship point to them. Yeah. Thank you.
What final question is just, is there anything you'd like to say in wrapping up before we clap for you one more time?
I think I've probably said enough. I will say, as I try to remain optimistic about American society, I also try to remain grateful that we're here at perhaps a challenging time for American society, and we have the chance to make a difference. And so I try to keep that in mind, and I hope other people do too.